This is the Israeli police attacking one of the holiest sites in Islam, the al-aqsa. Now, these attacks were followed up by airstrikes that ended up killing 22 Palestinians, including, I think it was like 9 children. In response to this attack, there were rocket fire to Jerusalem. That was the first time apparently that Hamas had sent rocket fire in Jerusalem in 7 years. But like I said, that was followed up with an airstrike. Think about that. They're airstriking basically civilian targets. Now, they're saying, oh, these are Hamas and everything else. But at the end of the day, the people who are around them, those babies, weren't combatants. They weren't baby combatants. And because they weren't children combatants, then the people that these guys were killing were basically civilians. They were firing on civilians based on rocket fire. No Israelis, if I'm not mistaken, were killed in this. If at most one, and I don't even think it was that one. This is not a clash. This is not a war. These are not two competing nations because according to Israel, Palestine is not a nation. And in the context of what is taking place here, you have one country that has nuclear weapons, and you have another civilization that country is basically subjugating. The only difference between what happened in the United States with the Native Americans is that there is a video camera, and this is taking place in the Middle East. Those are the only two differences. For all intents and purposes, what do you think they did in the U.S.? They would take land, they would take territory, they would create laws around it, and they would hold somebody else from land that they've stolen accountable to those laws. Israel is doing the same thing. A lot of people want to start with this. I don't think people should start with the scene. This is not the scene. The attack on the al-aqsa mosque. This is not where to start. As harrowing as this is, as disgusting as it is for these guys to basically go into a mosque. People were praying, yes, or in some cases protesting, but what they were protesting is magnificently important, and it's the thing that matters most. When the mosque, apparently there was a tree branch nearby caught on fire, or the mosque nearby caught on fire, Israelis were cheering it. Burn it down, let it burn, let it burn. You had right-wing Israelis working with the cops to go after Palestinians. And of course, like I said, 22 died. And that doesn't count the hundreds that were injured with pellets or stun grenades. Where you should start the story is here. Right here. This is what an eviction looks like. Real terms. Israel has been evicting Palestinians for decades at this point. The United States is pretending there was some kind of peace process, and while pretending there was a peace process, giving cover to the basically theft of more and more and more and more land. It never stops. It's a voracious thing. They just keep stealing more. Here's a neighborhood. This neighborhood is next. We're going to take it. We're going to put it in all sorts of laws. Settlers are going to come and take it. And you, as a Palestinian, are second-class citizen by definition that this is a Jewish state. And not just by definition, you have no rights in real terms that anybody will pay attention to. This is what an eviction looks like.
زي ما تشيلي زي حيمشيلي زي حيمشيلي وانا على لغه المستمر ولا تريد تبين علينا أنا نقول لك جيك أكتب بتمشي حتى تريد تبين على رشلان
حيم شلانه كيف نحن نلاقي حركات أنت مرسل تبعت على رش شلانه كيف نحن نلاقي حركات
يلا هدول عادي اطلع
تعيش خليكوا هون.
That's the operative question. Where do they go? They don't care about where they go. You just need to get out. But my whole life is here. Look, man, I don't want to use violence, but I will use violence if you need to go. That's not recent. This happened years ago when I remember pulling this clip. Here's another one. Hundreds of Palestinians forcibly evicted out of their houses and then bulldozed. Stop right here for a moment. If that's you, when you're looking at this, rational human being, what are you thinking about this? These are human beings that are being ripped from their homes and thrown out into the streets. And it doesn't matter if they have anywhere else to go. It doesn't matter whether they're innocent, guilty, or whatever else, because the thing is contrived anyway. They are being deprived of their land in a systematic way in order to basically take as much of that land as possible and put them in reservations / ghettos in the same way the United States has put Native Americans in reservations in the United States. It's almost a one-to-one. You can almost look at Israel as looking at a model of the United States as a role model, trying to basically affect the exact same policy where you have worse and worse land. I mean, for God's sake, here's another view of this. Listen to the way she described. Here's two families that were ripped from their homes. Also, listen to the pain in her voice. Because on one side of it, there's pain, there's anguish, there's heartbreak. On the other side of it, there's anger, legitimate rage, apoplectic, and from a cosmic level of right, because an individual has every right to defend their particular territory and their particular property. The catch here is just because you might have a right to do it, and just because you have this kind of philosophical, moral right to defend yourself, doesn't necessarily mean that God grants you a win. Britain was able to take the white man's burden all across the world, subjugating all of these various cultures, and each and every one of these cultures has a right to fight back, but whether they had a right to fight back was secondary to whether or not they had the power and the numbers to do so. And the same thing applies here. Each and every one of these Palestinians have a right to defend themselves and their property from foreign or eternal adversaries. And in this very specific instance, Israel has the military might to be able to forcibly go in and then have collective punishment for people who push back. This starts with the stealing of land. That's what this is about. Whatever you want to cast it into religious stuff, this is the stealing of land. This is the bad blood that's instilled into a community when land is stolen over and over and over again. Think of how blacks feel about cops in the United States when one of us is killed and gunned down in something that is considered an unjust killing. Think of the rage, the legitimate rage that is out on the streets when these cops keep murdering people over and over and over again. It doesn't necessarily seem to stop to the point where you have to say, my life matters. My life matters. What about Palestinian lives? They don't seem to matter at all. And this has gotten worse, by the way. With the Abraham Accords, you have all of these other states that supposedly was backing Palestine that basically sold them out on a whim. It was understood that the upper echelon of these guys were working with Israel, but under Trump, this became formalized. And within the context of that being formalized, you have the minimization of Palestine, their pain, their anguish, their depravity, that much more. Iran has not acquiesced. Iran has remained steadfast as a supporter of Palestine. Syria has remained steadfast, but for the most part, the other nations sold them out for 13 silver coins. Listen to the pain in her voice as she tries to articulate what it's like to be forcibly thrown out of your house by Israeli soldiers just show up in the night and just rip you from your bed.
Put us out, and they didn't let us. They didn't allow to us to go inside. Then we're trying to go inside my home because I can see my home there. It's empty, and I want to.
What would you do? What would you say? They were born into it. Quirk of birth. You could have been in that situation too. She's lost it all. And she has no ability to even go back to get the items that belong to her because they will shoot her. And she knows they would shoot her. I want to point out the events that are taking place right now in what's considered Palestine. And in the context of those events, this notion that what Israel is doing is basically what the United States did. For example, take a look at this. This is Gaza, West Bank. Doesn't that look like just an open-air ghetto or a reservation to you? Water supplies and everything else are entirely reliant upon Israel. Everything from revenue, the works. Israel has absolute and entire control over these regions. And yes, Hamas might have been elected, but from the standpoint of everything else, Israel is in control. Here's the other map. And just to put this in perspective, all of this started because Israel had dedicated an area that it was going to continue with the demolition. In the context of continuing with the demolitions, the people were already angry, and nobody likes to be forcibly evicted from their homes. The world has basically turned a blind eye. Netanyahu as a crook and maybe going to jail. And yet, the demolitions, the evictions, the theft of land, theft of houses, theft of property, the depravity of putting people in prison when they resist the fight back. Yes, that is continuing to go on. And to put this in perspective, this is what it looks like. 1947, after 1947, 1967, and now you see a smattering of places that is considered to be the West Bank. But within the context of this, the area is within this region. Now, and it's this region minus a factor because these are also being erased and taken and stolen. That's where you start the story. The other part doesn't entirely make sense if you don't get to the rage, the legitimate indignation that's associated with somebody ripping you from your house. There's no law or anything else that's governing the negative behavior, the consequences that are associated with this. They're all yours. Anything that you do at this point from the standpoint of aggression is met with due force, including force that may take down your house or people who are familiar with you in this collective punishment. This is the life that you lead. Resistance gets put in prison under even worse conditions. And all of those other nations abandon them to their fate. I want to talk about what's taking place right now. And the video is not necessarily going to be long, but, it does need to be named that Palestinians have every right to defend themselves as anybody else. And in the context of Israel and the way that they kill and maim, it is understandable whether Palestinians can win in a pitched battle or not. It is understandable why they will put their bodies on the line in resistance. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This content is brought to you by you, and I appreciate you allowing me to do it. There was a tree that caught on fire outside the mosque. And as the tree caught on fire, it looked like the mosque itself was on fire. And of course, when it looks like the mosque is on fire, the only thing you do at that point is chant and scream, basically to burn it down, right here. One of the holiest sites from standpoint of Islam. This is a fascist state. Full stop. I don't even know how it's argued opposite. There is no opposition that is thinking in the context of Palestinians and peace and everything else. That's off the table. All of these guys basically are on board for theft and stealing of land. That is the party line. That seems to be the only main party line. And so this is what you get, a fascist state that is organizing themselves under this notion of being a Jewish fascist apartheid state. The Palestinians, in this very specific instance, are basically being your land is being taken. Your land is being taken. You respond with protests. They're ripping you out of your house and throwing you into the street and doing this systematically, one neighborhood after the next. And in this case, this mosque. What do? How do you resist? Do you resist? And understand, in every situation that has to do with, on any level of resistance, your life is basically forfeit. And they would move on as if you never existed at all. These are the conditions that these guys are working in. And so you can understand on some level the pushback. Yeah, they fired rockets. They fired rockets because you guys basically was stealing their homes. And then when they responded to this theft of their homes, you use overwhelming force. You could do that. And it's unfortunate that the Western propaganda outlets was basically going to show this as if these guys are in some kind of pitch battle 101, or as if these are like equal forces. And they're going to talk about the number of rockets that were basically firecrackers that are fired that have basically little to no impact. Maybe fear factor, but little to no impact. The Israeli weapons kill. They do have impact. And they're used for that lethal force. And they're being used with lethal force here, murdering kids and adults alike. This is a travesty. And it is utterly disgusting that we continue to support these guys to the tune of billions, our tax dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars a day going into Israeli pockets to do just that. That process of basically expropriating land, stealing land from other human beings and doing it over and over and over again. And Joe Biden is giving cover to the exact same process, just like Trump gave cover to the process, and Obama gave cover to the process, and Clinton gave cover to the process, etc., etc., etc. The peace process was a dog and pony show only to allow the process to go to the point where it seemed impossible to come back from. How do you have a two-state solution when the states are ripped apart, where they basically are reservations or ghettos? And you can see it in a way that it's set up, especially Gaza. I'm going to end it here. I'm just greatly disturbed by what I'm seeing at al-aqsa mosque. And, you know, people want to ask this question about whether or not Israelis have a right to defend themselves. Israelis have nuclear weapons. They have tanks. They get billions of dollars from the United States just about weaponry. They will be okay. The question becomes whether or not it's okay to commit an atrocity because you've had one atrocity happen to you. If African Americans, after being enslaved, turns around and enslaved whites, does that make it right? And then it's, you know, what does it mean by right? Under any notion of the world that you want to pursue, does that make it right? Just because Israel had a genocide happen to it doesn't necessarily give Israel the right to commit basically a genocide, or at the very least ethnic cleansing on another group. And that's exactly what they're doing. I don't even know how it's argued otherwise. They're going to people's houses, forcibly evicting them and sending them to basically these, wherever they can go. And they're doing this over and over again, systemically, throughout the country. What is the end game? What was the end game for Native Americans? Reservations. I put to you that this is what this looks like. They are looking at America as an example of how to deal with the quote-unquote Palestinian question. And it seems like what they've decided upon were these killings every so often, the Palestinian lives, to keep them in check and push them away further and further. Because when you think about it, as you steal more land, what happens to the people that were living on that land? They're either going to die, they're either going to move, or they're going to become more compact in the areas to which they find themselves. And it could basically all three of those. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks all.